Hey guys, I hope you guys are having a great day today. If you're new here, hi, my name is Vivian. I'm a robotics engineer with a love for all things beauty and makeup related. And today, as you can probably tell from the title of this video, we are ranking every single eyeshadow palette that I have. And I'm gonna go in order from least favorite to most favorite. And my ranking kind of depended on a couple things. It depended on quality, price, and general color story. We are just gonna hop into it. So I have 19 eyeshadow palettes in my collection and we are just gonna go through it one by one. And I'll explain why they're favorites, why they're not favorites. And some of these I will maybe group together since some of them are a little bit tied. But for the most part, we have some very clear favorites and very clear favorites, if that makes sense. I want to first start off with two palettes that are not in my rankings list yet. They're more of honorable mentions just because I don't think I have enough experience with these palettes to really qualify their spot in my ranking list. The first one I want to mention is the Nabla Miami Lights Glitter Palette. So I've really only used this palette a couple of times, and as you can see, the glitters are kind of chunky in some places, which it is a glitter, so that's kind of what I expect. But the glitters are kind of rough on the eyes, so like when you apply them on the eyes, it doesn't feel the greatest, but I really like the effect it gives, and I don't really mind that glitteriness. I know a lot of people hate pressed glitters, but I am not one of them. I can appreciate glitter for what it is. Basically, this is an honorable mention just because I don't think I have enough experience with it to put it in my tier list, and I definitely feel like this is more of a palette that I reach for special occasions when I want a little bit of a pop rather than a palette I would use on the daily. So that is the Nabla Miami Lights Glitter Palette. I would say this is like, if I had to place it, it would be on the lower end just because I do only reach for it on specific occasions if I want a little bit of something something, but it's definitely not my favorite out of the palettes that I have. So the next palette I'm gonna mention is maybe a little bit controversial. So this palette is the Charlotte Tilbury The Super Nudes Easy Eye Palette. Maybe you can see from the close-up, but I haven't used this yet. I've literally never touched it. And so that is why it is on my honorable mention list, because I don't know how the shadow performs. I will say this is pretty expensive for 6 shades. I believe this is around $60. I'll have the price like on the bottom, of course. But for a palette that's that expensive, you only get 6 shades. The thing with Charlotte Tilbury, I will say, is that for the luxury prices that they charge, their packaging isn't always the most luxurious. And since I don't know how the shadows themselves perform, I don't know if this palette is worth it. I will say that out of the colors in this palette, it does seem like a palette that I would reach for a lot. It's just your nudes, so that makes sense as to why I would reach for it a lot. But is it worth like $56? That's up for you to decide. I don't know if I would spend the money again. I actually just realized that I have 20 eyeshadow palettes. Coming in at the number 18 spot is the Makeup Revolution collab with Soph at Soph Does Life, I believe, or maybe she's just Soph now. This is the Super Spice palette, and I just want to say this palette is relatively affordable. Most Makeup Revolution things are. The major qualms I have with this eyeshadow palette: one, I do not reach for this on the everyday. I really only keep this in case I want some eyeshadow looks that have primary colors. A lot of these shades are like true red, so that's the wrong side. The true red, orange, yellow, green, and the purples are very much there. This shade for me, this shade Lockdown, which is this like lilac-y shade, is definitely a dud for me. It does not show up on my eyes at all, and I have other palettes in my collection with similar lilac shades that perform way better than this one. You can kind of see there are a lot of, like in this shade especially, it kind of looks gross. That is because I tried experimenting with some mixing fluid to see if I could create like a graphic liner and stuff. It didn't turn out great. I will say the shimmers are pretty. They're very soft and they're very creamy. So I don't hate the formula of this eyeshadow palette. It's just not one that I reach for. If I ever do want a colorful look, I tend to gear towards some of my other palettes rather than this one. This one is kind of like a just in case I have a specific look in mind where I need a true red or a true orange or something like that. So that takes a spot at number 18. Again, it's not a bad palette. It's just not one that I reach for on a consistent basis, especially because this this purple shade is a dud for me. The shimmers are very pretty though, just to show you. Like, the shimmers are very pretty. This shade on the middle finger is the shade Dreamy, and this one has a very pretty reflect, kind of reminiscent of Colourpop Ritz in my opinion, but more of like a purpley tone. So it's not a bad palette, it's just not one that I reach for often, and that is why it is ranked at number 18. So the next palette I want to talk about is the Colourpop Baby Got Peach palette. The reason why this is ranked so low in my collection is because I do not reach for these shades at all. We know Colourpop is super affordable. I think this palette is like around $10, but these peachy shades are not shades that I tend to gravitate towards. And really the only reason I keep this is basically when I bought this palette, I bought the Colourpop State of Play set, which came with like 6 of their Colourpop 9 pans. And so this was included in the set. If this wasn't included in the set, I don't think I ever would have picked this up. So Colourpop's formula is very consistent in my experience, and the palette itself is fine, I'm sure. This is just not my typical color palette that I reach for, and so that is why it is ranked number 17. The next palette I want to talk about is this palette here. This is the Maybelline Nudes of NY palette. This was my first ever eyeshadow palette that I ever bought, which wasn't that long ago. It was maybe 2 years ago, I think, at this point. It is a very good neutral palette. As far as drugstore prices go, I think this was a very solid palette. Again, I think the main reason why it's ranked so low is because I don't reach for it that often. These eyeshadows are pretty powdery, a lot more powdery than some of my other neutral eyeshadow palettes, but for the drugstore, I don't think you can beat it. I believe this palette was around $13 when I bought it, but you have a lot of these like golden tones that I don't reach for often, and a little bit of some mauve tones, some cooler tones. So I think in terms of versatility, there is a lot, and I feel like you could create a lot of cohesive looks with this. It's just not one that I reach for. I would say my most used shade is probably Soloist, as just like a transition shade, and the shade Self Starter, which has a pretty big dip there from me using that dark brown as a eyeliner. I think one of my biggest qualms with this palette is that it doesn't go very deep. I wish this brown was a little bit deeper. There is a little bit more of like a purpley brown on this side that is deeper, but it's a little bit more cool tone than what I would like. I think my main qualm is just I wish this darker brown was a little bit darker. In general, it's a powdery formula, but that doesn't bother me. You just like tap out the fallout, but it blends really easily. I would say that this was a very good choice for a beginner makeup palette when you're like just getting into eyeshadow and you don't want to spend luxury prices on a neutral eyeshadow palette. Coming in at number 15 is actually another Colourpop palette. This is the Colourpop Cloud Spun palette. Similar to the Baby Got Peach palette, it has a pressed glitter, and I just don't reach for pink tones on my eyelids very often. One, you guys know that I don't wear eyeshadow often to begin with, and when I do, I really like a pop. I really like something that gives it a lot of oomph, and I tend to do that with glitters. Kind of the same vibes as the peach palette. I like the palette. I like the colors. It came in the set, so I'm gonna keep them. It's just not something I reach for often, especially because I just don't wear eyeshadow that often. And I've noticed that I've been moving away from monochromatic palettes in my everyday life. I mean, obviously I don't wear eyeshadow that often, but I haven't really done a ton of creative looks in the past year or so, I would say. I definitely want to get back into that, and that's why I still have these monochromatic colorful palettes around. Like on the scale of me wearing eyeshadow, these colorful palettes are the palettes that I reach for the least amount of time. I think that made sense. So the next palette I want to talk about, maybe kind of a surprise, but coming in at number 14 is this Urban Decay Naked Wild West palette. So while I like the color story of this palette, the Urban Decay formula is not my favorite. I definitely need to make more use out of it, but I do enjoy the color story of this palette a lot. I really like the 2 pops of color with these teals here, and it has a nice array of warm tone and cool tones. So I think if you're a really big fan of Urban Decay's formula, I think this is a really good palette for a beginner, especially that wants to like dabble in a little bit of color. I honestly think I need to pull this out more often because I do like this color story a lot. I know that a lot of people rave over Urban Decay's eyeshadow formula. I just think Urban Decay's eyeshadow formula is a little bit outdated. The glitters are a little bit chunky, so maybe you can see there. The glitters are a little bit chunky, but I think they do the job well. I also really like the packaging of this. I kind of like that snake print. So really, out of all of the Urban Decay palettes that I've ever witnessed, this is my favorite packaging wise and color story wise. I just think there are better eyeshadow formulas out there, especially since Urban Decay is a little bit of a higher end brand. And I don't think I've ever seen this palette specifically go on sale. I could be wrong about that, but it is a little bit pricey for a formula that I don't think is necessarily the best. I think doing this video, it makes me want to use it a lot more. So I'm gonna leave this out on my desk and see how many times I reach for it in the next couple weeks, couple days. Coming in at number 13 is the Beauty Bay Pastels palette. So this was kind of what I was talking about when I said that in the Makeup Revolution palette, the lilac shade is very much a dud for me, whereas in this palette, you can see that lilac shade is very pigmented. This palette was like $5 when I bought it. I bought it with the bundle with the Pastels palette and the Beauty Bay Youtopia palette, which I'll get to in a little bit. But this palette is so affordable. The pigment on these very pastel colors, which are notoriously hard to create, are so pigmented. And for how pigmented they are and how cheap they are, I'm amazed. I truly cannot believe how good this palette is for how cheap it was when I bought it. For this palette specifically, I would say that most of the eyeshadow looks I do with it are one and done eyeshadows. I don't think this necessarily counts as like an everyday palette, but I really like reaching into it when I have a colorful look in my mind. In the summer, I like to do colorful looks that are like one and done like this and just have a single shade all over the lid, and I love that for this. Especially since it is so affordable, it is absolutely insane to me how Beauty Bay can create this formula for not that much money. Plus, it honestly kind of feels more luxurious than it is because it has a magnetic closure for the palette there. And I just think that makes it feel a little bit more luxe, even though the palette itself is drugstore. I wouldn't say drugstore. I don't think it's necessarily drugstore, but like affordable to the max. So these next 3 palettes, I'm gonna kind of group together, but if I had to rank them, Colourpop Mint to Be would be number 12. Colourpop Lilac You A Lot would be number 11. And then Colourpop On Cloud Blue would be number 10. And again, it's kind of the same thing as the other 2 Colourpop palettes I've mentioned already. The formula is nice. I like Colourpop's formula and consistency in their eyeshadow formula. I think these monochromatic palettes are very pretty when you know a specific look you want to do, but I just don't reach for them that often. I don't reach for color that often, and when I do, I tend to prefer the Beauty Bay palettes because there is so much pigment in those Beauty Bay palettes, whereas these, it takes a little bit more time to build up. Not to say these aren't beautiful. I know when I first started my Instagram page, I did looks with these palettes and they turned out wonderful. And I really liked the way that they looked. I just think that my tastes have changed, and while I like these palettes and I like the vibes of the monochromatic palettes, I just don't think I reach for them enough to rank them higher. Coming in at number 9 is my Colourpop Going Coconuts palette. Basically, it's a really good palette for how affordable it is. You know that I tend to like neutral colors. It definitely has some cooler tones and neutrally tones, but it's a little bit like pinkish as well. Basically, it's a really good versatile palette. You can tell kind of by the fading of the writing here. This is my go-to travel palette, just because you can get like a pretty glitter look out of it if you want. It has those shimmer shades right there, but this dark brown also goes pretty deep, so if you want to like do a shadow liner, you could do that as well. And it's basically a great palette that's super affordable, that I'm not terrified that I'm not terrified that if the shadows break, I'm gonna be sad. Overall, a really good palette. I really like this. I think that if you're gonna go with any of the Colourpop palettes I've mentioned, I would go for this one. So the next eyeshadow palette I want to talk about is the Pat McGrath Labs Celestial Odyssey palette. This palette is beautiful, don't get me wrong. Pat McGrath is known for her eyeshadows and her eyeshadow formula. I think I just don't reach for this that often because of the color story. It is a very colorful palette, and like I said before, I don't reach for color that often. I think my favorite shades in this palette are this green here, this glittery green, and this is a shimmery lilac purple. I think you can tell in the shifts, but those two colors are absolutely stunning. This shimmery lilac is much more subdued, whereas this glittery green is very in your face. I need to look at more inspo photos to create a look with this, because in my mind I don't really see a ton of cohesive looks using just this palette. Of the Pat McGrath palettes that I have, this is the lower end, but this was also a lot less expensive. So her Mothership palettes go for about $130. So her holiday collections tend to go for less. I think this was only around $80 instead of the full $130. And I think I got this during the Sephora VIB sale as well, so it was a little bit less money. I like this palette. I like the formula a lot. I think I just need to spend more time looking at inspirational photos to try and make a cohesive look out of it. The shades themselves are stunning, would not change a thing. And the packaging is also really pretty as well. It kind of gives me Lunar New Year vibes, which I don't think it's supposed to. Like I think these are like angels, but the red and gold gives me Lunar New Year vibes, and I like that as well. So the next palette I want to talk about is this tiny palette here. This is the e.l.f. Cookies and Cream palette. Basically, it is a really nice palette for what it is. I can take either of those shimmers and just like press them on the lid, swipe them on the lid, and I'm good to go. I have a darker shade here if I want to do a shadow liner, and I have this transitional shade here in case I need to kind of mesh it all together. I think this is a really good travel palette if you're kind of like me and you're kind of like a one shadow and done type of person, or one and done eyeshadow type of person. And I tend to just either do like a mix of both of these shimmer shades all over the lid and call it good, or just do a little bit of the dark brown as an eyeshadow liner. So I think it's just really good for how inexpensive it is. I think this is only $4 now that e.l.f. raised their prices, but basically just super good for what it is, as in it's literally just the 4 shades, so you really can create good cohesive looks with it without a lot of thought. The next eyeshadow I want to talk about is the M Cosmetics Divine Skies eyeshadow palette in the shade Rodin. So this eyeshadow palette is super tiny and compact, which makes it great for traveling. The shades themselves are super pretty. The mattes blend out super easily. There's a kind of shimmery shade that is super pretty on the eyelids basically, and it has a darker shimmer in case you want to deepen it up a little bit. So that's what the shimmers look like. This middle one is this top shade here called Muse, and it's a little bit more of a glittery shimmer than the lightest shade here, which is called Whisper. Basically, it's super versatile. Again, you don't really have to think about it. You can create a really cohesive look with just these 6 shades, or you can do one, or you can combine them to create a more complex look, but it has the depth you need to deepen it up and make more of a smoky eye. Hey guys, it's editing me here. Sorry for the bad lighting. But looking back at the footage and looking at the close-ups, the M Cosmetics Divine Skies eyeshadow palette in the shade Rodin and the Colourpop's Going Coconut palette are super similar. Like, the Colourpop's palette, I would honestly say, is a dupe for the M Cosmetics Divine Skies eyeshadow palette. They're obviously like a tiny bit different, but you can definitely dupe the vibes with the Colourpop palette. And the Divine Skies eyeshadow palette is like $40, and the Colourpop Going Coconuts palette is $14. So if you like just neutral tones, I would honestly say the formula is relatively similar, so I would maybe go with the Colourpop palette instead of the M Cosmetics palette. Basically, it's just very versatile. I'll say one thing about this palette that kind of bugs me is, one, the hexagonal shape makes it a little bit hard to store, and two, the top shade, Muse, got hard pan on it very easily when I first started using it. I have kind of transitioned the way I use it to try and avoid getting that hard pan, but I mean, I can already see it again, it's still hard panning. So it's not my favorite, I don't love that, but in terms of the formula and the looks I can get out of this palette, I really like it. Plus, it is so compact, like it's smaller than my hand. It's so compact that it makes it good for travel if you don't have a lot of room. Number 5 is actually the Nabla Cutie Midnight palette. Basically, it's a very blue palette, but it has some fun things about it. The shade Quiet Storm is a duochrome shade, which I think if you like tilt it all the way, you can kind of see it has a purple shift, which is stunning. The lightest shade Air, or the shade Air, has quite a lot of pigment for such a like pastel-y color. I like that it has more of a brown to tie it all together, and the shade Sapphire is a stunning shimmery shade. Same with Alma. This is how I would want my monochromatic palettes to look like. Not that this is monochromatic, because obviously there is a shade here, this brown shade, that is not monochromatic, but I feel like the shade, that brown shade, kind of pulls it all together and grounds the palette a little bit, which I appreciate. You know I love Nabla's formula. The packaging is a little bit more luxe with the magnetic closure, and it is also small and compact. And yeah, I'm glad I have this. I think this is definitely my go-to like blue palette if I were to use one. I really like Nabla's eyeshadow formula. I feel like it is very user-friendly. And even if you're not into color, I have another Nabla palette that I will get to eventually that is stunning, basically. Coming in at number 4 is my Pat McGrath Mothership 9 palette, Huetopian Dreams. I think this is Mothership 9. This palette has a lot of pinky tones, but the main stars here are these 2 shades on the end. These 2 are the Astral shades that she only has in her Mothership palettes, and basically they have such a pretty reflect to them. They are unbelievable. This shade here is a duochrome green to purple shade, which is top tier. It doesn't go very deep, so the deepest shade is this shade right here. So it doesn't necessarily ground the palette, but the special effects shades definitely make the palette. Those shades are kind of what you're paying for, and I know Pat McGrath is expensive. This palette is $129, so it's worth a pretty penny. but it feels weighty. I really like the packaging of it. The carton that the packaging comes in is stunning. And, you know, Pat McGrath is known for her formulas. The mattes are super blendable and easy to work with. The shimmer shades are so like creamy and comfortable. And the astral shades are definitely where the hype is at with Pat McGrath. So those are the two astral shades right there. And you can just see how much reflect they have. They're absolutely gorgeous. Coming in at number 3 is the Beauty Bay Youtopia palette, which is a little bit surprising to me because I don't use it that often, but this color story is so pretty. So it's very similar to the Pastels palette, as in it has a couple of those pastel-y shades, but these shades tend to look more neon. So this orange and this yellow are definitely more neon than the Pastels palette, and I really like that you could get a fun neon look out of this. And again, similar to the Pastels palette, I tend to just wear like one all over the lid and call it done, but the palette is so pigmented, and again, it's so affordable. So just swatching some of these like neon shades for you, like I'm really not applying a lot of pressure, I promise you. These are stunning, and I love that the palette is so affordable. I will say that you can get a little bit of staining with these. For me, that's not a huge deal. I kind of expect that with super bright colors, but for how inexpensive the palette is, for how much pigment there is, I think it's a great deal and a great palette, especially if you want to branch into color, because these palettes are so affordable that I think that they're more than worth it. Coming in at number 2, I think you can guess it, but it is the Natasha Denona Biba palette. So this palette is one of my absolute favorites. I think it is so versatile. It has warm tones, it has cool tones, it has deep enough shades to really ground a look. It has the shimmer shades that are beautiful, but the main star of this palette are the cream to powder formulas. There are 4 cream to powder formulas in here. These 2 browns right here, and then these 2 down here. So the black is also a cream to powder, which is a game changer, because if you really want to do like a shadow liner, this makes it super easy. Basically, the palette is super pretty. It kind of leans a little bit orange, so if you're not into those kinds of tones, I would maybe stay clear, but it's super easy to work with. It is expensive. Natasha Denona palettes are generally pretty expensive, but this is the biggest size palette, or not the biggest size, but this is the bigger sized palette. This is the full size palette, and this retails for like $130. So definitely pricey, definitely luxury. I don't necessarily think you need this palette in your life, but if you have the money to spend on it, I do really enjoy it, and I really enjoy the experience of using it. I will say the packaging could be a little bit better. Just the feel of it feels kind of lightweight, and for how much I'm spending on the palette, I really want to feel some luxuriousness to it. The formula speaks for itself. The formula is where the money is at, but I'm saying that for the money that I'm spending on this palette, I just wish it felt a little bit weightier. It wasn't just plastic packaging. The nice thing about Natasha Denona palettes is that on the bottom you can see these holes. These holes, you can pop out the eyeshadows, and you can rearrange the eyeshadow palette to be however you want it. So if you have some of her other palettes too, you can kind of create your own custom palette, which I've seen a lot of people over on Instagram do. But basically, this palette is stunning. I think it's super versatile, and I think that if you are a neutral lover and you have the budget to spend the money on this, I do really like this palette. And last but not least, maybe you can kind of guess, I've kind of spoken about this a little bit already, but this is the Nabla Side by Side palette. So this is in my #1 spot, and I've raved about this before, but basically it is the perfect neutral palette. You have warm tones, you have cool tones, you have some olivey shades, you have some pinky shades. These two shades here, Better Society and Body and Soul, are duochrome shades. So if you want a little bit more pop to your eyeshadow look, you can use those. It has a nice light blend or transition shade. It has a gray if you're feeling a little bit more of a cool tone vibe. Basically, these are stunning. I don't think I will ever be without this palette. And get this, it's not cheap, but it is a lot cheaper than some of my other favorites. So I believe this palette retails for around $40, and for this color palette and the formula, I think it is worth it. I think this is so user-friendly. I think that even if you don't know anything about eyeshadow, this could be your go-to palette. It kind of comes off, it's not super pigmented, which as a beginner-friendly palette I think is better. It's better to build up the color than try and take it away. So I am in love with this palette. You can kind of see these two duochrome shades have gotten a lot of use out of them. Basically, this palette is my end-all be-all, and for the price, it is definitely more affordable than the Natasha Denona Biba palette, and you get a little bit more range with this eyeshadow palette, which I appreciate. Along with that, it has a magnetic closure, and it feels a little bit more weighty than the Natasha Denona Biba palette. So for the price, I think this palette is worth it. It's a little bit big, like for hand reference. It is a little bit big, so I wouldn't say this is the best travel palette, and it kind of has some substantial like negative space, so I feel like it could be a little bit smaller packaging wise, but the formula is there, the color story is there, the price point is right, and so out of all of my palettes, this is definitely my favorite palette. And that is it. That was the last palette. I really liked doing this video. It reminded me of palettes that I had that I kind of forgot about and want to pull back out again, namely the Naked Urban Decay Naked Wild West palette. And you know, it makes me really think about how many eyeshadow palettes I have and how much I don't use. Basically, I have definitely a lot of colorful palettes, which are surprising but not surprising at the same time, because for me, I kind of feel like I have the neutral palettes that I want to have, so I don't feel the need to spend more money on neutral eyeshadow palettes, whereas colorful palettes are always like a little bit more fun, bring me a little bit more joy, and most of the colorful palettes I have are relatively affordable. Yeah, I really enjoyed doing this video. If you want to see a different version, like maybe I can rank my blushes, bronzers, and highlighters next, or it's different videos of course, but maybe I can do something similar with my blushes or bronzers in a future upcoming video. I think blushes would be good because I do have quite a few blushes. Yeah, let me know if you want to see that. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye!